Hey, what's going on, folks? It's Mo Hamadi with you, and welcome back to thebusinesslounge.com. So first of all, I just want to apologize for not keeping up with my posting schedule, but things have been a little hectic. We're in the middle of redesigning our website, preparing the course material that will hopefully be up in our new members area. Plus, I've had some pressing family issues I've had to deal with. But anyways, I figured I at least owe it to you to continue this investing series and keep putting up as much content as I can, even if time is a little tight lately. Now, let's go ahead and get right into it. So today, like I just mentioned, we're going to carry on with our Investing for Beginners mini-series with this video on investing in commodities. We're going to take a look at what's traded in the commodities market, understand the investment jargon that's used, and we'll also take a look at the difference between commodities and the more commonly known shares and bonds, for example. Of course, there are some obvious differences, but it is worth keeping them in mind if you're going to invest in this market. And last but not least, we're going to take a look at how commodities are traded and the way that you as an investor can access these commodities. So, what are commodities? We see them all around us, right? The commodities market actually influences so much around us, like the price of a gallon of gas when you fill up your car, or the price of a cup of coffee at Starbucks, or even if you brew it at home. The price of the electricity flowing in our homes or offices. So the commodities market matters a lot more than most people think because they have a major effect on our daily lives. But there's also an interesting opportunity for investors. So first off, let's talk about some of the jargon used in this market. There are so many different types of commodities, and probably most of you can name a lot of them. But in the markets, they're generally broken down into a few categories or types. So first off, we have the metals. We have non-precious metals like copper, nickel, lead, aluminum, or aluminium if you're living in the UK or you just prefer saying it that way. These are metals more commonly used by manufacturers, and there's a market for trading large quantities of these non-precious metals. Next, we have the precious metals. Now, precious metals are broken down into gold, silver, platinum, and also palladium, which is sometimes used in wedding rings when it's been put in a catalytic converter. So those are the so-called precious metals, and all the metals in general are known as hard commodities. The next type of commodities we have are called agricultural commodities, or another way they reference them are soft commodities. Now this is also a large market where things like sugar, cocoa, coffee, and soybeans are sold. Just a little side note, the reason people call these soft commodities and the metals hard is because if they were in a sack and you kicked them, the hard ones would hurt and the soft ones obviously wouldn't, or at least they wouldn't hurt that much. The last type of commodity we have is energy, where you have oil, gas, and so on. So those are the labels that are usually used often to describe the different types of commodities, where each of them have some slightly different characteristics, different markets in terms of where they're traded, and obviously have different users in terms of buyers and sellers. So that's the first thing I wanted to cover in terms of jargon and the type of market we're looking at. Now, before we delve into commodities, and actually a lot of people like to dabble with the commodities market because it is an exciting place to trade, but you really need to know a bit about what makes a commodity different. There's obvious differences, of course, but buying and selling commodities is not the same as buying and selling shares or bonds, or even simply opening up a bank account. Now, having said that, there are certain features we need to look out for in the commodities market that perhaps we wouldn't need to worry too much about if you were buying shares in Apple or Coca-Cola, for example. These features in the commodities market are what make it a high-risk place. Prices can be really volatile, and that's because there are so many deciding factors that affect the price of these commodities. So for example, some features that you wouldn't really worry about or consider if you were buying shares is that they can be stolen, or they perish, or they can go bad. So that means you've got storage issues, right? Some commodities you can store in some warehouse and lock them away for a couple of years and they'll look just the same, like gold, for example. Although you'd be pretty crazy to store gold in a warehouse, maybe a vault in a bank would work out better. But we can't say the same for fruits and vegetables or corn or dairy products, right? These are all perishable, so that means there's an aspect to commodity management that you don't get with shares and bonds. There are warehouses all over the world that specialize in the storage of perishable commodities, so that when someone shows up with an order to buy however many tons of whatever commodity, it's readily available in the right quantity and it hasn't gone bad or become rotten. So that's the storage factor or feature that you need to consider in the commodities market. The next feature you need to be aware of is delivery and security, right? Think about it. Trucks get into accidents, ships sink, stuff blows up. This isn't a problem per se for someone who's trading in treasury bonds, right? But it's definitely a risk you have to deal with when buying and selling commodities. So as a buyer or seller, you need to figure out what you're going to pay to store that commodity and what you're going to pay to insure it during delivery. You wouldn't insure a savings account or a share in Apple or Coca-Cola in the same way you would insure something in the commodities market. The next feature you need to be aware of is politics and world events. This is one of the reasons why commodities are so volatile. Look at what's happened to the energy sector because of Corona, the latest event to drastically affect the market. So many shutdowns and disruptions happened that affected the market worldwide. The same thing happens when a civil war breaks out in a country that's the main exporter of a certain commodity. Like Ivory Coast, for example, 10 years ago was responsible for 35% of the global distribution of cocoa. When the UN put an export ban on all Ivory Coast cocoa, of course this affected prices. I think within a year of the crisis, cocoa prices shot up like 12%, all because of the political problems happening over there. So if you want to be in the commodities market, then you need to start reading up on the news and understand what's going on around the world, or at least where the specific commodity is grown or being produced. Now, other than politics, another obvious thing you would want to follow or be aware of is the weather. Again, obviously this usually wouldn't be a problem in, say, the New York Stock Exchange or with treasury bonds, unless of course something dramatic like COVID hits again, God forbid. There's one more point or feature of the commodities market that you need to be aware of, and that's the fact that there's no income. You might get a dividend from a share. If you buy a bond, you might get some interest, put some money in the bank, and over time it may increase. Unfortunately though, buy yourself some gold and you don't get any income. As an investor, this is something you need to think about. Most commodities won't be an extra source of income, so if that's something that you want from a safe investment, this is not where you should be. So you just need to be aware of the different factors that affect commodities that any other investor in any other market won't really worry about. So the whole point I'm trying to make here is that the commodities market is very unpredictable, and because of its volatility, you need to make sure you do your homework if you actually decide to get involved in trading cocoa or gold or silver or whatever it might be. Now, I know this all might sound a bit scary or daunting to think about investing in this market, but like I've always said, if you know what you need to know, then it really isn't that scary at all. It's kind of human nature to be like that, to have that fear of the unknown. And that's why I'm saying if you equip yourself with the proper knowledge, you can rest assured that you're making sound decisions that probably won't turn around and bite you in the ass. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at how you can get into this market and actually begin trading. So first of all, we have what you would call the professionals. And by professionals, I mean big buyers and sellers all around the world who use these exchanges. There's exchanges in Chicago and New York, known as the Mercantile Exchange or the Metals Exchange in London. So there are people out there who are interested in buying and selling large quantities of metals or wheat or cocoa. So trading in this wholesale market, if you will, is done through the New York or the Chicago Mercantile Exchange or the Chicago Board of Trade or the London Metals Exchange. Now, obviously, this isn't the full list, but there are actually entities all around the world dedicated to trading in this market. And most of them are based in major cities and financial centers that only trade in commodities. You know, actually, a lot of them still use that old style of waving around and yelling and using hand signals down in the pit or on the trading floor. Not all of it is done electronically, like we might assume. So if you want to go see a bunch of people in colorful suits doing it old school, these would be a good place to go. Like I know the London Metals Exchange is the only place in England that uses that open screaming method of trading. Now, as an investor, what does this all mean for you? Obviously, you're not going to become a member of the Chicago Board of Trade or any of the other ones I mentioned. That doesn't really make sense, of course. But in the retail market, as an investor, you basically have two options. The first option is to do physical trades and go for the commodity itself. Some people do physically buy some gold, for example, and you can buy some gold coins and store them. But of course, there's that added concern of where you're going to store the gold. You obviously don't want to be storing a large amount of it somewhere in your house. You probably want a more secure place than that, like a vault in a bank or something. So obviously, this isn't really the best option for a lot of people, or it isn't the most practical choice for them. Yeah, it could make sense to have a dozen or half a dozen gold coins in the house, but not a ton of copper, right? So in reality, most retail investors will go with the second and more probable option, which is to buy some sort of a fund. Now, there are funds where you can have or hire a fund manager who specializes in buying individual shares linked to the commodities market, or you can get an ETF or exchange traded fund. ETFs are basically shares listed on the exchange that will track the price of a commodity or a group of commodities. So for example, you can get an ETF that tracks the price of gold or silver or any individual soft commodity or a basket of them. These usually are pretty simple and relatively cheap, and this is why for a retail investor, usually the most viable option is the exchange traded fund. But I will tell you, as with any investment, you need to be really careful. And because this is an investing series for beginners, I won't get into too much detail. But if you do decide to go with an ETF, please make sure that in the documents that describe it or the fact sheet, make sure that it's actually tracking the physical commodity and isn't just backed by some dodgy derivative like futures or swaps. So if you're purchasing an ETF that's tracking gold, for example, you need to make sure that it's tracking physical gold and is actually backed by a holding of gold in a vault rather than something that's backed with a derivative. So we've reached the end of the video here, but just to summarize, the commodities market does offer great opportunity and there are lots of different assets to trade in, grouped into the metals, the soft commodities, and the energy markets. And there are a number of factors that you need to be aware of and to take into consideration when trading in commodities. It really isn't a place for a novice investor, and you definitely need to do quite a bit of homework ahead of time. Now, in practice, there are so many ways to trade in commodities, and a lot of them aren't really even open to retail investors, which is why I would recommend usually going down the fund route. And when you do that, obviously your best bet is to choose something that is simple and relatively cheap, which would be your exchange traded fund. So there you have it, folks. I hope you enjoyed this video and it gave you a nice little intro into commodities, and you can now go dive a little deeper and see if maybe down the line it's a good option for you. Or maybe it is now, who knows? Again, make sure you guys do your homework and don't make any hasty decisions, or any decisions for that matter, until you absolutely understand what it is that you're getting into. Before I sign off here, if you guys enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, and if you haven't done it yet, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any other videos I come out with. Until the next one, I wish you all the best, and I'll see you soon. Ciao.